Hey guys, I hope you're doing well. This is, yet another instructional video from the Peckham compound in the during the pandemic, forced isolation. Um, Today, I thought I would talk to you a little bit more about writing off the subject and Richard Hugo's Triggering Town while talking about a couple of other poems that relate to it. You're going to have to forgive me for my abilities with the technology here. There'll be some pauses and gaps while I try to find things and bring things up for you. If you're in 377 and you're watching this is a video I'm actually making for my 360 class. But I thought would be good for you to actually watch as a sort of review assignment. A couple of the poems that I'll be talking about, we've talked about already in your class, but a couple are also on the current schedule. And what I wanted to talk to you about today, which seemed like a good follow-up to the video I did on associative drifting, is this concept of writing off the subject, and how do we do that? How do we get away from the initiating subject? Now, the reason we want to do that is because poetry basically functions. What makes poetry interesting is this concept of radical juxtaposition, where you put two unexpected things together and you end up with this third thing. But what inhibits that for many poets is we want to say what we want to say. You get an idea for a poem and you want to write, you get a strong feeling about racism or addiction or love, and you want to say something about it. And what ends up happening is that becomes incredibly confining. Richard Hugo's Triggering Town actually is one of the most important poetry books, or books about writing poetry, that's ever been written. It's been used in almost every creative writing class in some way or another that's ever existed. And even if it's not being directly addressed, almost every poet of any worth has read Triggering Town and has used it as a basis for their understanding of how you get at writing good poems. And there's some central ideas to Triggering Town that I wanted to focus on today. The first is this idea of not that when you want to write poems, you want you don't want the music to conform to the truth. You want the truth to conform to the music. Now, I actually like what he says there because when we think about mediums that affect us at a sort of fundamental, almost intuitive level, we think of music. Music, it affects us and challenges us and moves us, not just on a literal level, not in terms of its message, but in terms of its expressive qualities. And what I mean by that is when a song really moves you, well, it's only in part because of the lyrics. Most of what's happening is happening on this sort of auditory, physical level that also affects us emotionally. So the sound comes through our ears and we process those as meaning. But words definitely have definitive meanings, but along with the words is the music, is the rhythm, and are the sounds that are creating it. It also, if we were to touch the stereo of a car, if you're just sitting and you have the bass turned up really loud, you can feel the music coming up through you. And poetry should be that experience. And in fact, poetry originally was set to music. All poems were set to music. So you wouldn't just hear someone read a poem, and you'd never just read it on the page. It would be accompanied by a guitar or a lyre or whatever instrument the person happened to have on them. So these bards, these bardic poets, were always composing with music. Now that we've gotten away from that, the language must carry the music. But if we think about how one note leads to another note, it's not logical. You can take music theory, but most folk musicians are not taking music theory. They're following a note by another note, a sound by another sound, based on their intuitive associative relationships. So you're bending a string in a guitar because it sounds like a train whistle. You're trying to make that sound and get it that feeling. There is a music theory behind that, but really it's a way of getting the sound to travel someplace, to bend it and change it and make it weird and interesting and strange. So Hugo is talking in his book a whole lot about this idea of making of making music and trusting the music of the language and trusting the imagery to lead you where it's going to go. Instead, and it's all right to have an initiating idea, but to let that idea lead you to places that you don't expect, because writing ultimately is is a tool for discovery, not and for expression, not for bludgeoning someone with your own agenda. And so so he actually, and I'm going to share one of the poems that he's talking about here with you. Hopefully this will work. And it's called Rattlesnake, and it comes up on the handout on page 6. And what he says just before this is the poet's relation to the triggering subject should never be as strong as must be weaker than his relation to his words. The words should not serve the subject should serve the words. This may mean violating the facts. For example, if the poem needs the word black at some point and the grain elevator is yellow, the grain elevator may have to be black in the poem. You owe reality nothing, and the truth about your feelings everything. And so he gives us an example of this poem called Rattlesnake. And I don't think he ever attributes who this poem is by, but it's quite a poem. And I'll just read it. Rattlesnake. I found him sleepy in the heat and dust of a gopher burrow, coiled in loose folds upon silence in a pit of noonday hillside. I saw the wedged bulge of the head hard as a fist. I remember his delicate ways, the mouth a cat's mouth yawning. I crushed him deep in the dust and heard the loud seethe of life in the dead beads of the tail fade as wind fades from the wild grain of the hill. Think about how unexpected that last line is. In the dead beads of the tail, fade as the wind fades. And I can actually imagine the poet. I imagine myself as a poet, and I'm writing this poem, and I'm trying to figure out how do I describe this sound, this feeling, the sound that is a feeling of the life leaving this deadly animal. And then the beads of the tail sort of petering out. How do I get that sound? And he talks about it fading, and of course he thinks, well, what fades? Well, the wind fades. And then he thinks, oh, from the wild, like he thinks about, and he's probably thinking about where he hears wind, and he thinks about it on a grain field, on a hillside, and then, well, and then he thinks about the snake being wild, and then he gets the wild grain of the hill. And so what is this poem about? Well, it's about a number of things, and that's its joy and its pleasure and its privilege and your privilege in reading it, that you don't necessarily have an answer to that question. It's about life and death and power, and it's also about even when something dies, even something dangerous or deadly, there is a loss that something has passed out of the world. And that's what he's getting at there. But we can also see the repetition of language, that not only is he getting there through ideas, but he gets there through sounds. A lot of W sounds, wild and wedged and yawn, and and D sounds, deep in dust and loud, which also picks up some of the W sounds. So, and then we have wind and wild, and then we have these I sounds and hill. So part of the knitting, part of the structure and tapestry of the poem is in the pleasure of the language that we hear. So that's that's a pretty incredible example of what's going on there and how that functions. In Hugo is encouraging us to depend on rhythm, tonality, and music to get at the poem and to get at truth. He also suggests, and this is kind of controversial in the poem, that it's impossible to write meaningless sequences, that if you just play with language and you put the words together, especially objects, you will, by the nature of how our minds associate and create meaning, you will create meaning, that it's impossible to create a meaningless sequence of images, because when we put them together, we start to create images. So for right now, I'm staring out my window. Okay, I see a tree house. I see, a chimney. I see, the spire of a church. I see daylilies blooming on the hillside. I could just write those images down as the beginning of a poem, and they would start to accumulate and create value and tension. The reader would get a sense of scenery, but also, so the treehouse is actually dilapidated and rotting, and there are vines growing up along the inside of it. And that in and of itself becomes symbolic. It's not a symbol, it's a treehouse. It's sitting right there. I can show it to you. But it develops symbolism and value simply by its being there on that hillside among the daylilies by the church spire. I think I'll write that poem. Maybe I already have. I'm recording this, so I can just play it back to myself. But that's the pleasure of this, is so much of what good poetry is this associative connections that we make as we walk around and we go, look at that, oh my God, look at that. And also paying attention to how the sounds of things. So when I do write that poem, when I rewrite it with an ear to the ground, thinking about how those sounds work. I'm going to talk about a couple of other poems that are also moving in this kind of beautiful kinetic sort of way. So one of the other ones that I wanted to share with you is this poem by Yusef Kamanyaka. And if you're in my 377, you've already heard this one, but there's nothing wrong with hearing it again. And let's listen to Yusef Kamanyaka read it himself, if I can get this to work.
First place I read in Australia is in Sydney, a place called Harold Park Hotel. The title of this poem is Blue Light Land Sutra for the performance poets at Harold Park Hotel. The need gotta be so deep, words can't answer simple questions all night long. Notes stumble off the tongue and color the air indigo. So deep fragments of gut and flesh cling to the song. You gotta get into it so deep, so it crystallizes on eyelashes. The need gotta be so deep, you can vomit up ghosts and not feel broken. Till you're no more than a half ounce of gold and painful brightness. You gotta get into it, blow that saxophone. So deep, all the sex and dope in this world can't erase your need to howl against the sky. The need gotta be so deep you just can't wiggle your hips and rise up out of it. Chaos in the cosmos, modern man in the pepper pot. You gotta get hooked into every hungry groove. So deep the bomb, locked in rust, opens like a fist. Into it, so deep rhythm is pre-memory. The need gotta be base and animal need to see and know the terror we are made of, honey, cause if you wanna dance this boogie, be ready to let the devil use your head for drum.
Pretty great poem. The poem is mostly functioning, though, on this hyperkinetic, associative, play with the idea of need, an intense need. So you get a line like "the need gotta be so deep you can." So let me go back. You got to get into it so deep, salt crystallizes on eyelashes. Now imagine that when we think about it, I've said before, like there's no crying in poetry because I'm so tired of like poets using tears to convey emotion. It's not that we don't cry; it's just that it becomes kind of a shorthand that's an easy shorthand. But look what he does with that. Instead of instead of saying you got to get into it so deep you start to cry, he says got to get into it so deep salt crystallizes on eyelashes, so the pressure turns the tears into crystal. I mean, that's intense. Or so need so deep you can vomit up ghosts and not feel broken. I mean, vomit is there's a lot of dark imagery here, but he keeps getting at this sense of release, and it's image by image by image. It's all just images that he associates with this idea of need. You got to get hooked into every hungry groove so deep the bomb locked in rust opens like a fist, which almost opens. You think of a bomb opening. It's almost like a flower image, but it's this intense free associative capacity to move from image to image. And of course, you can hear the rhythm and the sound. It's really leading this. Excellent poem. in which you can see some of this free associative music and image movement happening. Um, Now, of course, there's a triggering subject there. He's starting with this idea of like, okay, he's talking to performance poets, and he's got to talk about, well, how do you write a performance poem? Where does it come from? But he very quickly leaves the subject of of being on stage performing to an audience, and he gets into this idea or concept of need and all of the ways that we feel it and all the situations in which we feel it. And it just becomes kind of like almost more of an exploration of an idea, and he's just letting it go and travel where he needs for it to go. Let's take a look at one more poem that I think is super effective on this level of moving, um, mostly by basis of um, of this kind of associative speed that gets very quickly away from its triggering subject. And this is called "Boy in a Stolen Evening Gown" by Saeed Jones. In this field of thistle, I am the improbable lady. How I wear the word, sequined weight snagging my saunter into overgrown grass, blonde split end blades. I waltz in an acre of bad wigs. Sir, who is no one, sir, who is yet to come, I need you to undo this zipped back, trace the chiffon body I've borrowed. See how I switch my hips for you, dry grass cracking under my pretend high heels. Call me, and I'm at your side, one wildflower behind my ear. Ask me, and I'll slip out of this softness, the dress a black cloud at my feet. I could be the boy wearing nothing, a negligee of gnats. Now, Danez Smith, no, sorry, Saeed Jones, not Danez Smith, Saeed Jones um, is of course exploring this idea of gender fluidity and the idea of how how gender is like a garment that we put on, and but also that how it can be put on and taken off here. That's the initiating idea. But the poem is not good because of the initiating idea. The poem is interesting because of where that he allows that idea to take him. I wear the word, sequined weight, snagging my saunter in overgrown grass, blonde split end blades. So he gets himself, somehow he finds himself in a field wearing this stolen evening gown and imagines and to completely allows this connectivity between the land and the environment and the gown itself that's happening. The sequined weight snagging my saunter into overgrown grass blades. So the grass blades become blonde split end blades, which would be hair. Um, and then the hair leads to the waltz in an acre of bad wigs. Um, and then he moves forward in the next stanza to this idea of taking off the gown, and totally embraces that. So, sir, who is no one, sir, who is yet to come, I need you to undo this zipped back, trace the chiffon body I've borrowed. All right. So there is this embracing the image, traveling with the image, letting the image take you to where it's going to go, instead of worrying perhaps so much about what you were originally trying to say. If you trust the imagery and the sound and the music, it will take you there. One of the other principal techniques that Hugo talks about in triggering towns, of course, is this idea of the triggering town. And this is kind of interesting because I've always believed that poetry really does make a great use of at least starting in a very grounded space. Like good poems tend to have strong settings. So in his work, he says that one of the ways to get away from the triggering subject is to begin. He talks about starting small, thinking small, but what he means by that is not so much thinking small instead of in like, an image can be the size of a building, but he's in terms of abstract concepts. not getting overwhelmed by the abstract concept that might be the initiating subject of the poem, and instead starting with a visual image or a sound, which is really what he likes to do, and following that sound. But he likes the idea of starting with a town, with an imagined town in his case. And the prompt that I attached to this is a triggering space, which you can do if you've already done this in 377, pick a different space and try again. But this idea that so what did I do in developing my discussion of this? I lifted my head, looked out my window, and described what was right in front of me, um, because those images are immediately apparent. It also works too because even though I've stared out this window a million times, I have no real emotional connection to anything out there that I'm looking at. So it allows me to very much free associate. So the treehouse I'm looking at could lead me anywhere. It could lead me to tree houses that I've been in at any point in my lives. I've never been in that treehouse, so I could imagine my way inside of it, and some magical things could happen there. And I do encourage people to use and to think about magical spaces that they have traveled and where they might go. Um, so it's always kind of interesting to take that route. In his case, he talks about the grain silos, that as a place where he might go to explore. But it could be any productive place, and so he's just kind of trying to give you guys a sense of of where you might be, where you might go, and then to start with an image and allow that image to take you to the place you want to be. Sorry, something happened into my screen here that got a little distracting for me. But go over to the triggering space prompt and take a shot at that. It might lead you to a really interesting poem. And at the very least, it'll allow you to work within the realm of that. I'm having a little trouble bringing this up right now, but what I would like to do is to at least read you this poem by called "How to Get to Green Springs" by Dave Smith. Um, I think it's a really, again, a very effective poem for thinking about. Ah, there it is. Ha, okay, so I can show it to you. Okay, so this is "How to Get to Green Springs" by Dave Smith. Green Springs is actually in West Virginia, and it really gives you a sense of place. And I think both classes have encountered this before, but it's worth a second look to think about how we can take a place and go through it into other interesting places. How to Get to Green Springs by Dave Smith. Nobody knows exactly when it fell off the map or what the pressures were on its flooding river. The hedge, the tottering mailbox were gone. That dimple of light from the bicycle that raised itself to creak at noon across a clattering bridge names my father. His blood, silent as a surging wish, drags this town lost through my body. A place I can get back to only by hunch and a train whistle that was right on time. But time and trains were never right in Green Springs, West Virginia. What color could map the coals grime, shack shored against the river every March? Mail left to rot because no one answered to occupant. Farmers low on sugar cursed the heat and left bad cigars. Boys would puff back to clouds where they dreamed of girls naked as their hands under outfield flies. Scores were low. There were no springs for the sick. Women lined their walls with the Sears catalog, but the only fur they ever had was a warbled rabbit. To get here, think of dirt, think of night leaking, the tick of water bugs, a train held in Pittsburgh. That's an incredible evocation of place. And it definitely thinks small. This is a really good example of a lot of what Hugo is talking about. You could go through this poem and really map out all the repeated sounds, and I encourage you to do that. But really, that's something you want to train yourself to do intuitively in your own work. Also, how much thinking small is there here? It's really just a collection of images that would seem disconnected, except that they all come from the same place. Now, certainly there's selectivity here. You'll notice that there's a lot of the imagery that relates to ideas of flooding. There's a lot of imagery of poverty. Um, you know, so there's images of the body that speak to each other. And so there's a lot of knitting going on in here. But there's very little attempt to say anything in particular or specific about the town. It's simply a collection of those images. All right, so again, try out that writing prompt that's over at Blackboard, and good luck with that. I've already gone on too long, and I hope this is a relatively helpful tutorial.